Our flagship program now, the State Electronic Records Initiative, which we've just renamed as an institute, has been around for about 12 years now. They've been talking about this question of why we're still keeping these things. And I think that the main difference between most technologists and the folks that are centered in the IT world, they're really about now. They're about the day-to-day functions of what's happening now. But an archivist is specifically responsible for this long-term preservation and the access component.
This is Associations Thrive, the podcast celebrating successful associations and their leaders. I'm your host, Joanna Pineda, CEO and Chief Troublemaker at Matrix Group International. Listen in as top association executives tell all, revealing the creative and innovative ways they're increasing membership, generating revenue, nurturing engagement, and reimagining their organizations. By the way, if you've launched a new initiative, created new member services, or updated your governance structure and are seeing great results, I want to hear your story, and so do my listeners. I'd love to have you as a guest. Go to podcast.matrixgroup.net and apply to be on Associations Thrive. Now let's dive into this week's show. Today, I'm speaking with Joy Banks, Executive Director of the Council of State Archivists, or CoSA. Joy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Joanna.
Joy, tell us about CoSA.
Yeah, so CoSA is an independent nonprofit association that supports the state and territorial government archives across the country. So our membership includes 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. And our work focuses on research, education, and advocacy to provide leadership that strengthens and supports state and territorial archivists in the work that they do.
And Joy, what is the work of a state archivist? Like, what do they do and why do we still need them?
So at the core, archives are essentially just any collection of historical record. And so for the state and territorial government archives, they're collecting the work of state government. Depending on the state and how that is set up, they may also be collecting municipal records. They can sometimes be collecting personal historical records. So the collections of the people that live within the state really varies. But at the end of the day, they really are committed to the collection, preservation, and making accessible all of these things to the public so that they can help to support accountability in government work.
And Joy, what kind of records are they keeping? I mean, clearly they're keeping information about laws so that you can say, for example, what was the law for, I don't know, raising pigs in California in the 1930s?
Yeah, they collect a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it depends a little bit on the statutes that they work under. So unlike some like public and private archives that create their own collection development policies, government archives are driven by these legislative mandates. So sometimes it's in the Constitution, the records that they keep. It can be limited to a specific branch of government. So quite a few function within the executive branch. So they're focused on gubernatorial records, the activities and actions of that level of government. Some of them have responsibility over the legislative branch. So they're getting records that are coming out of the laws and discussions of any House and Senate structure. Some of them have responsibility over the judicial branch as well, so the laws and decisions. But in other instances, those branches of government might have their own archives. And then in addition, some do vital statistics. So in some states, they'll get all of the information for marriage licenses, birth certificates, death certificates, and have responsibility over that. Voting records, the official records of votes in states, and then passed along to the federal government. It's just really any activity that a government would do as these representatives of the public that they serve. Government archives have some level of responsibility in collecting and maintaining and making those accessible.
And Joy, are these paper archives or are they digital as well?
In most instances, the archives are now collecting electronic records.
Okay.
But they still have a responsibility to maintain any paper records that they would have. In all instances, archives are dealing with things called retention policies. These are pretty typical in the corporate realm too, where a record has a particular schedule depending on its content. So if you have an email that has a particular content regarding a meeting of a committee, it might have a permanent records retention applied to it, where this is something that we keep forever, or it might have a temporary timeline to it, where after a period of time, it will be destroyed because its purpose has been served. So it's kind of both sides of it, and those apply to no matter what record type it is. I mean, if it's paper, if it's electronic. Some of our members have responsibility to collect recordings of audio and video, the things that are happening within the legislative houses. And so they're collecting all sorts of different types of things and just focused really on the content of those. That's kind of their primary attention.
There is so much information being stored everywhere. Why do we still need archives? Why do we need state archives?
Yeah. Well, and it's an interesting question that our group has been talking about quite a bit. We've been investigating this question of electronic records in government. Our flagship program now, the State Electronic Records Initiative, which we've just renamed as an institute, has been around for about 12 years now. They've been talking about this question of why we're still keeping these things. And I think that the main difference between most technologists and the folks that are centered in the IT world, they're really about now. They're about the day-to-day functions of what's happening now. But an archivist is specifically responsible for this long-term preservation and the access component, where an IT professional, they might not care if you can find that one file that you really, really need right now. But an archivist would be the one who could help you set up a file structure, naming conventions, and making sure that you can get to that particular piece of information at the point in time when you need it. And you think about some of the disaster responses, you think about insurance claims, lawsuits, they're all going to archives to get evidence, proof, the record of ownership, property lines, your insurance rights, and using those things to then make sure that operations continue, that people get the compensation that they might be owed, and really move forward in life.
Wow. Well, your members are the state archivists. Are there national archivists as well? I mean, I know there's a museum on the mall called the National Archives. So what's the relationship there?
Yeah, there is a National Archives.
And it's not just a museum, it's an office.
It is, and with multiple buildings. And I'm not, maybe won't get this number right because they aren't our members, but they have multiple facilities across the country. So it's not just Archives 1. So that's the one that has the museum in it. It's not Archives 2, which is located in Maryland and is more of a storage facility, a functional archive that's doing digitization work. But then they also have oversight of regional facilities that house records that apply to the regions that they serve. They also oversee all of the presidential libraries. So their operation is quite large and not just what's happening in DC. They are in the executive branch. And so in the same way that many of our members are recording gubernatorial records, they have responsibility for the presidential records. They are engaged with the amendment process and have some level of authority there. They have oversight of the FOIA request. So anybody who wants to do Freedom of Information.
Freedom of Information Act, right?
They're involved in that process. They also are engaged in convening discussions to help facilitate the declassification of certain records. So they really do quite a lot more in this records processing and making sure that different agencies of the government deposit their records into the National Archives according to these record schedules, just like we were talking about with the states. The relationship between federal archives and the state archives kind of follows some of the models of how the federal government works with a lot of state agencies. There's sometimes joint custody of particular records. One example that our community has worked with is veterans records. So the federal government has responsibility of everything that's coming out of the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs. But then at the state level, they actually have some oversight over National Guard records. And these things often overlap in needs for the public as they're trying to access things. So we've navigated that conversation a lot to try to clarify responsibility of who owns some of these records. Where does that care and responsibility for the long-term preservation and access go? You think about some of our newer states. So like Alaska is one of our newer states. And when they kind of finished their state archives and the establishment of that, they then had to go into a negotiation process with their territorial records. So the United States and the National Archives had all the territorial records and kind of navigating those boundaries of where ownership lies and eventually working towards transfer of much of Alaska's history back to Alaska to make sure that they were the caretakers over that history.
Well, thank you for that. I did not realize just how important the job is of being an archivist and the importance of the state archivists and the national archivist. So we're going to talk about CoSA in a second, but before we do that, let's talk about your journey. Now, being executive director of CoSA was your first executive director job of an association and your first association job. So you got to tell us about this journey. How did this happen?
Yeah, my career path has been long and winding and not the one that I ever anticipated.
It's always that way, Joy.
It's always that way. So I actually have a Master of Science in Library Science. So I'm a librarian by trade and started in a mid-sized private college as a catalog librarian. From there, went to another small historic garden, oversaw a Carillon library, which is a whole other podcast, I'm sure, but dabbled in archives there. I became an accidental archivist while I was in that position. My private life kind of put some of my career on hold as my husband and I moved into caretaking for my grandmother, was a consultant for a while, doing some work and project management with nonprofits, then worked for another nonprofit that had a support with libraries and museums as a program officer, overseeing some of their grant programs specific towards digitization and preservation of at-risk AV materials. And it was from there I got into the national network of libraries and archives. And CoSA, the job for the executive director, came up. It was kind of what I saw as my next step, stepping into an executive director position. They were willing to take a risk on me as somebody who had never been an executive director before. I was willing to step into their space and help them kind of on the next phase of their journey. And I mean, I guess the rest is history, which is ironic talking about archives, but
pun intended.
Yes, pun definitely intended.
Well, Joy, you clearly have a good understanding and appreciation for the work of your members, but your job is different. You're running an association. So what's that like to learn the business of running an association?
So I will say, like, as a professional, I was a member of a number of associations during my profession and saw the value and benefit of these shared spaces where you were connecting over common problems, situations, shared interests. So I brought all of that with me. I served in different board positions over the years. And joining this space, it's allowed me to apply the things that sometimes frustrated me about being a volunteer in an association onto the other side of the executive world. One of the things that attracted me to CoSA is that I knew that I wouldn't have to do sales because we have a defined membership.
Ah, yes.
So I knew, because sales are not my strength, the recruitment, the drive for growth and membership, which I know is critical in a lot of association spaces, was not going to be something that I needed to do at CoSA. Our membership, it's 56 institutions. Unless we get a new state or territory, we're not growing our membership. So what that allows us to focus on then is the cultivation of the people that exist within our community. And that is something I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about making sure that these people that I serve have a space to share their concerns, their celebrations, their laughter, their tears sometimes, but just making sure that this is really a space that serves them and is also true to the profession. One of my past presidents in a business meeting, he's like, we don't have a crisis in mission. We know what our mission is because in a lot of instances, it's already been defined. So what we focus on is really this foundation of support in making sure that the members that are included in our space know their value, know their authority, know their expertise, and are empowered to share that in meaningful ways with other people.
Well, that's an excellent segue into talking about CoSA. And I want to dive into something that you mentioned during the prep, which was in 2019, you had a bylaws change. And you said that that was difficult. So tell us about that change. What was it and why'd you do it?
Yeah, so I joined the association in 2022. So the 2019 bylaws change was before my hiring, but has become kind of the change point that has put CoSA on the path that it's on right now. CoSA has its roots in 1989. It kind of formed as a real loose collaboration between folks who were involved in a very particular activity within these government archive space. And over the course of them meeting, they realized that they really had more to talk about than just that one particular point of their job. And so they started meeting more formally. In 2002, they incorporated as a nonprofit entity. And for that whole history, its membership were the director level people. So these state and territorial archivists of the 56 institutions, it was just those 56 people. So they did some strategic visioning and conversations, thinking about sustainability of the organization, seeing a bit into the future. These activities started in 2016, 2017. They could see pending retirements. They saw their aging body and recognized that they really needed to engage a broader set of people into these conversations that they were having. So in 2019, they did a successful bylaws change that shifted membership of CoSA from that state archivist to the state archives.
Oh, so they went from professional to trade.
Yes, so we are a full trade association. And anybody who works at any of our 56 member institutions can participate in the activities of CoSA. That was in late 2019. And then the beginning of 2020 happened and the world shut down.
Right.
Many of our members experienced a wide range of interpretations of closure, but it essentially meant that the group who had met regularly since 1989 and were friends suddenly didn't have any in-person meetings again until 2022. So I came on in June of 2022, and we had our first in-person meeting in July of 2022. So I was meeting people for the first time, but many of them were also meeting people for the first time because in that intervening space, quite a few people had retired, new archivists had been hired, and they had never met each other. And we were also starting to try to implement this inclusion of staff members and anybody who was working at the institutions. So it's been a journey the last 3 years. Last year, 2024, was our first solo in-person meeting. For the history of the association, we always kind of attached our meetings to other mission-aligned associations where they kind of carved out a room for us on a day.
Mm.
And that's where our meeting space was. And last year was the first time that this group got to just be CoSA and explore the interests and topics and things that were most interesting to them. We found a small boutique hotel and bought the whole thing out. It was like a CoSA reunion. Like people were just delighted that they were the only people they were running into in the hallways. And it felt like they were able to have this like concentrated time together to really hash out some of their most pressing questions. Now we're planning our next one for September. But yeah, it's been a culture change and one that has been bumpy. I think that a change like this that goes from what ultimately was described as this like exclusive club to something that's a broader membership base has been a challenge to navigate for them. But we continue to work through it.
Well, let me ask you a question. So when you say that it used to be 56 members and now it's 56 organizations, now it means that the IT director, the HR manager, and the front desk person can be members along with the actual state archivist, which means that they're coming into the association with varying levels of knowledge and professional development needs. So how are you navigating that?
Oh gosh, Joanna.
Did that change in terms of like what you do for the members, or is it still primarily education for the archivists or networking for the archivists?
We are still in the process of answering that question.
Ah.
And one of the things that we just went through was migration of our website, and we migrated to a membership association platform. CoSA has never had a membership association platform. They've never had.
Well, you didn't need one if you could manage 56 people in Outlook.
It was just 56 people. Yeah. You can do that in a spreadsheet.
Right.
But when we shifted to having hundreds of people, which still sounds small, I'm sure, to many listeners, the dynamics and connections of these people, like we just didn't have a way that we could manage that. So in December, we migrated, and we're still in the process of kind of onboarding because we've never operated with this ability to be very specific in our messaging, to try to collect these interests from the people who are involved with us so that we can help to make those connections and find out what it is that they want. Because one example might be like the education departments of these archives. So the people that are doing public programming and working with K-12 students, maybe bringing in high school or undergraduate internships into these spaces, they've never really had a space within CoSA to talk about those kinds of things.
Ah.
Do they want one? We can give it to them.
Oh.
And so it's building these connections, getting some data back, so then we can start to shape and form these spaces. I think one of the most interesting things about this group that I've learned from them is that they like to meet. They like to be in spaces together. They like to talk. They don't like listservs. They don't like putting something in writing. The nature of government work, sometimes they have to be a little cautious of that practice, but they just want to talk with their colleagues. They want to have a question and a space they can ask it in and work out the details together. And so that has been a lot of our energy this year. We're essentially breaking our committee structure. We're rethinking our webinar program that we've had for 15 or more years and trying to rebuild something that is going to feed the interests of this next generation of state archivists and try to motivate them to the mission and purpose of this work so that when positions are opening in these middle or higher level management jobs, that it's the folks that have been in these spaces interested in applying to them instead of fearing the responsibilities of stepping into these higher level management positions.
Man, I love this. It sounds like you're completely reimagining the organization.
Yes.
For example, I'm thinking about IT directors in the past. They maybe never had a home, but now they're finding that they can find other IT directors at state archives to talk about how do you deal with this mounting volume of data to make it accessible, searchable, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's one of our big projects. We've had a series of projects kind of focusing on these technology questions. And it's interesting, every state is different, and most states have these CIO roles.
Right.
So we're also, just like CoSA serves these government archives, we have a whole suite of sibling associations at the state government level that serve the needs of CIOs, the budget officers, the HR managers. And in some states, those positions exist in these separate departments. And in other states, there are these positions within the state archive spaces. And so we try to keep these open lines of communication across association lines even and work collaboratively on these projects because, I mean, there's no way that you can do this work of government without speaking with these other agencies and really acknowledging, we're most focused on the record. So you have to acknowledge the full life cycle of a record from the moment it's produced to the moment that it's entering the permanent preservation space or it's being destroyed according to a records policy.
Or it's being accessed by a researcher.
Yeah.
Well, Joy, I want to thank you today for educating me and my listeners about what archivists do. I hope that you'll come back in a year because it sounds like this is a year of reinvention and innovation.
Oh, yeah.
And reimagining. So please come back next year and tell us about the meetings and what you're doing for the members. Thank you for an amazing interview.
Thanks, Joanna.
Thanks for listening to Associations Thrive. We're so glad to have you here. You know, my personal mission and the mission of my company, Matrix Group International, is to help associations and nonprofits increase membership, generate revenue, and thrive in the digital space. I want to hear stories of how your organization is thriving in today's challenging landscape. Please apply to be on my show by going to podcast.matrixgroup.net. By the way, do you need help with a digital initiative? Maybe it's a website redesign, a new membership database, or a hybrid meeting that you're planning. I'd love to connect with you. Please visit the Matrix Group website at matrixgroup.net. Thanks again for listening to this week's episode of Associations Thrive. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating, post a comment, and share it with your colleagues and friends. Bye!